November 23, 1944, dawned gray and humid over the volcanic ridges of Leyte Island, Philippines, as Private First Class Johnny Mitchell crouched behind a fallen coconut palm, his Browning automatic rifle growing slick with sweat in his trembling hands. The staccato crack-o-f rifle fire echoed through the jungle canopy above, punctuated by the distant thunder of artillery that had been pounding Japanese positions for 3 days straight. Mitchell's squad of 12 men from the 24th Infantry Division had been tasked with clearing a series of interconnected cave complexes that honeycombed the limestone cliffs overlooking Ormoc Bay. The caves had become a nightmare for advancing American forces. Intelligence reports indicated that at least 40 Japanese soldiers, remnants of the 16th Division under Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto, had transformed the natural formations into an impregnable fortress. Machine gun nests commanded every approach, while interconnected tunnels allowed defenders to appear and disappear like phantoms. For 72 hours, repeated assaults had been repelled with devastating casualties. Sergeant William "Bull" Harrison crawled up beside Mitchell, his weathered face streaked with mud and cordite. "Johnny, you see that main cave entrance at 2 o'clock? That's where their command post is. Intel says Yamamoto himself is holed up in there with his staff." Harrison's voice carried the weight of too many battles, too many friends lost to the unforgiving Pacific theater. Through his field glasses, Mitchell studied the cave mouth. It yawned open like a hungry maw, approximately 20 feet wide and 15 feet high, carved naturally into the cliff face but reinforced with logs and sandbags. The Japanese had positioned their Type 96 light machine gun to cover the entire approach, its barrel occasionally glinting in the filtered sunlight that penetrated the jungle canopy. According to reports from the 24th Infantry Division's after-action review, archived at the National Archives, the cave complex had already claimed 43 American lives in unsuccessful assault attempts. The Japanese defenders had shown remarkable discipline, holding their fire until attackers were within 30 yards before unleashing devastating crossfire that left no escape routes. Mitchell's squad had been specially selected for this mission based on their experience in cave fighting on Saipan earlier that year. Each man carried extra grenades, Bangalore torpedoes, and flamethrower fuel. But it was Mitchell's bar that Harrison was counting on most. The 20-pound automatic rifle could deliver sustained fire at a rate of 500 rounds per minute, making it the squad's primary suppression weapon. "We go in fast and low," Harrison whispered, sketching the assault plan in the damp earth. "Rodriguez and Thompson will lay down covering fire from the left flank. I'll take Jenkins and Murphy around to the right. Johnny, I need you to put that bar on full auto and keep their heads down while we move in close enough to use the Bangalore." The plan seemed straightforward, but Mitchell had seen too many straightforward plans go sideways in the chaos of combat. The Japanese on Leyte had proven to be fanatical defenders, often fighting to the last man rather than surrendering. Colonel Yamamoto's troops were battle-hardened veterans who had retreated from Tacloban in good order, setting up defensive positions that maximized every geographical advantage the island offered. As the squad prepared to move out, Mitchell checked his ammunition one final time. 20 rounds remained in his current magazine, with 6 full magazines in his cartridge belt. In 90 seconds, those rounds would determine whether his squad lived or died in the volcanic caves of Leyte. The attack began at 1400 hours when Rodriguez and Thompson opened fire from their concealed position behind a cluster of bamboo. Their M1 Garand rifles cracked in steady rhythm, sending 30-06 rounds spanging off the cave walls and forcing the Japanese machine gunners to duck for cover. Harrison's hand signal launched the assault, and Mitchell felt his legs pumping beneath him as he sprinted across the 40 yards of open ground that separated the tree line from the cave complex. The Japanese response was immediate and overwhelming. 3 separate machine gun positions opened fire simultaneously, their 7.7mm rounds chewing up the coral sand around Mitchell's boots and whining off the volcanic rocks. Tracers streaked past his head like angry fireflies as he dove for cover behind a natural depression in the ground, his bar clutched tight against his chest. "Johnny, we need suppression now!" Harrison's voice carried over the din of battle from somewhere to Mitchell's right, but the young soldier couldn't see his sergeant through the smoke and dust kicked up by the enemy fire. A Japanese grenade exploded 20 feet away, showering him with coral fragments and leaves. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with the sulfurous odor of volcanic soil filled his nostrils. Mitchell rolled onto his stomach and brought the bar to his shoulder, flicking the selector switch from safe to full automatic. Through the weapon's iron sights, he could see muzzle flashes winking from at least 3 positions inside the cave mouth. The Japanese had constructed an interlocking field of fire that covered every possible approach route, just as they had been taught in their military academies. His first burst of automatic fire walked across the cave entrance, 20 rounds expended in less than 4 seconds. The heavy .30-06 bullets struck sparks from the reinforcing steel beams the Japanese had installed, and he saw at least one machine gunner duck away from his position. But return fire intensified, forcing Mitchell to press himself deeper into the coral sand as bullets cracked overhead. From his position, Mitchell could hear Harrison shouting orders to Jenkins and Murphy, but their voices were growing fainter. A quick glance to his left revealed Rodriguez slumped over his rifle, a dark stain spreading across his khaki shirt. Thompson was still firing, but slowly, methodically, trying to make each shot count as his ammunition ran low. The cave complex was proving to be even more formidable than intelligence had suggested. According to testimony later recorded in the Pacific Theater combat interviews conducted by military historians, Japanese cave defenders on Leyte typically constructed multiple firing positions connected by tunnels, allowing them to shift positions when under direct attack. This mobility made conventional suppression tactics largely ineffective. Mitchell slammed a fresh magazine into his bar and prepared for another burst. The weapon's bipod legs were extended, giving him a stable firing platform, but he knew that prolonged automatic fire would overheat the barrel and potentially cause a malfunction. Each burst had to count, had to achieve maximum tactical effect while conserving ammunition for the prolonged fight that seemed inevitable. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto's voice could be heard echoing from somewhere deep within the cave complex, shouting orders in rapid Japanese to his defenders. The Japanese commander had positioned his men expertly, using the natural contours of the cave to create overlapping fields of fire while maintaining covered routes for repositioning. Every tactical advantage lay with the defenders. As Mitchell prepared to rise from cover for his next firing position, a movement in the cave mouth caught his eye. A Japanese soldier was moving between positions, carrying what appeared to be additional ammunition for the machine guns. It was a fleeting target, visible for perhaps 2 seconds, but it represented an opportunity that might not come again. Time seemed to slow as Mitchell tracked the moving figure through his bar's sight picture. The Japanese soldier was young, probably no older than Mitchell himself, wearing the distinctive olive-green uniform of the Imperial Army's 16th Division. His path would take him directly across the cave mouth, exposed for exactly the time needed for a well-placed burst of automatic fire. Mitchell's finger tightened on the trigger, feeling the familiar resistance that preceded the weapon's thunderous response. The burst lasted 3.5 seconds, 20 rounds fired in full automatic mode at a cyclic rate of 550 rounds per minute. Mitchell's bar bucked against his shoulder with each shot, the muzzle climbing slightly despite his efforts to control it. The heavy .30-06 bullets, each weighing 150 grains, struck the cave mouth with devastating effect. Sparks flew from metal surfaces, stone chips exploded from the walls, and dust billowed in thick clouds that momentarily obscured the target area. What Mitchell couldn't see, but would learn later from Japanese survivors, was that his burst had achieved something that 3 days of concentrated artillery bombardment had failed to accomplish. The rounds had struck a critical structural weakness in the cave's ceiling. where Japanese engineers had removed too much supporting rock to create a wider firing position for their machine guns. The limestone, already fractured by artillery concussions, finally gave way under the cumulative stress. Inside the cave, Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto was coordinating the defense from a command post located 20 feet back from the main entrance. He had positioned himself where he could observe the American assault while remaining protected from direct fire. With him were his communications officer, 2 machine gun team leaders, and a medical corpsman treating wounded soldiers. The cave's acoustic properties amplified every sound, from the crack of rifle fire to the shouted commands of squad leaders. When Mitchell's burst struck the weakened ceiling, the initial collapse was relatively small, perhaps a cubic yard of rock and debris. But the limestone formation was riddled with stress fractures created by decades of monsoon rains and geological movement. The sudden removal of supporting material created a cascading failure that propagated throughout the cave's roof structure. Within seconds, tons of rock were falling into the confined space. The collapse trapped 8 Japanese soldiers in the forward fighting positions, cutting off their escape route to the deeper tunnel systems. Among them was Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka, a veteran of the China campaign who had survived 3 years of continuous combat. Tanaka found himself pinned beneath a limestone slab that weighed several hundred pounds, his legs crushed, but his upper body free enough to continue fighting. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto's command group was caught in the secondary collapse as weakened sections of ceiling continued to fail. The communications officer was killed instantly when a falling rock struck his head, while the medical corpsman found himself trapped but conscious in a pocket of air beneath fallen debris. Yamamoto himself suffered severe injuries to his left arm and shoulder, but remained capable of issuing orders to his surviving men. The irony was not lost on the Japanese commander. For 3 days, concentrated artillery fire from American howitzers had failed to breach their defenses. But a single burst from an infantry automatic weapon, fired at exactly the right angle and striking precisely the correct structural weakness, had accomplished what hundreds of high-explosive shells could not. The cave complex that had seemed impregnable was suddenly transformed into a tomb. From outside, Mitchell could hear the rumbling crash of falling rock, followed by screams and shouts in Japanese. Dust poured from the cave mouth like smoke from a chimney, and the machine gun fire that had been so deadly moments before fell silent. The sudden quiet was more unnerving than the previous cacophony of battle, suggesting something catastrophic had occurred inside the limestone fortress. Sergeant Harrison's voice cut through the settling dust and eerie silence that had replaced the constant chatter of machine gun fire. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" His command echoed across the battlefield as American soldiers gradually realized that the Japanese defensive fire had completely stopped. For the first time in 3 days, the approaches to the cave complex were quiet, except for the distant boom of artillery targeting other Japanese positions along the Ormoc Bay perimeter. Mitchell remained prone behind his cover, Barr still trained on the cave mouth, unsure whether the silence represented a tactical pause or something more permanent. Combat experience had taught him that apparent victory could transform into disaster in seconds if defenders were merely repositioning for a counterattack. The dust cloud billowing from the cave entrance suggested structural damage, but Japanese troops on Leyte had proven remarkably resourceful at continuing resistance even after suffering heavy casualties. "Thompson, check Rodriguez," Harrison ordered as he began moving toward the cave complex in a low crouch, his Thompson submachine gun ready. The sergeant's movements were deliberate and cautious, decades of infantry experience evident in how he used available cover and maintained fields of fire. Behind him, Private Murphy carried the squad's Bangalore torpedoes and demolition charges, prepared to clear any remaining defensive positions. Inside the collapsed cave, the situation was desperate beyond anything Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto had experienced during his long military career. The command post was buried under several feet of limestone debris, with only small pockets of breathable air remaining. Of his 8-man staff, 3 were dead and 4 were seriously injured. The main tunnel connecting to the deeper cave system was completely blocked, trapping the survivors in a space roughly 10 feet square. Private Thompson's examination of Rodriguez revealed a through-and-through bullet wound in the shoulder. Painful, but not immediately life-threatening. The Puerto Rican soldier was conscious and angry, more concerned about his damaged rifle than his injury. "Sarge, I can still fight," he insisted, though blood loss had left him pale and shaky. Thompson applied a field dressing while keeping watch on the silent cave mouth. According to declassified reports from the 24th Infantry Division's Intelligence Section, later deposited at the Army War College archives, similar cave collapses had occurred on other Pacific islands when natural limestone formations were subjected to prolonged artillery bombardment, followed by precise small arms fire. The geological surveys conducted after the war revealed that Leyte's volcanic limestone was particularly susceptible to structural failure when certain load-bearing sections were compromised. Mitchell slowly rose from his firing position, maintaining his sight picture on the cave entrance while Harrison's team approached. The bar felt heavier now, its barrel hot from the sustained firing. 23 rounds remained in his current magazine, enough for another burst if needed. But something about the absolute silence from the cave suggested that further resistance was unlikely. The dust had begun to settle, revealing the extent of the structural damage. What had been a 15-foot-high cave entrance was now reduced to an opening barely 4 feet high, partially blocked by fallen limestone slabs. No movement was visible in the shadows beyond the debris field, and no sounds of reorganization or equipment being moved could be heard from the interior. Sergeant Tanaka, trapped in the forward fighting position, could hear American voices growing closer, but found himself unable to move his crushed legs enough to reach his rifle. The machine gun he had been operating was buried under rock, its barrel bent at an impossible angle. Around him, 2 other soldiers remained alive but seriously injured. Their training demanded continued resistance, but their physical condition made such resistance impossible. Harrison reached the cave mouth and signaled for his men to take covering positions while he examined the entrance. The structural collapse was obviously extensive, but whether any Japanese soldiers remained alive inside the cave system was impossible to determine without entering. Standard doctrine called for clearing such positions with grenades and flamethrowers, but the risk of further collapse made such tactics potentially suicidal for the assault T. Harrison's flashlight beam penetrated the dusty interior of the collapsed cave, revealing a scene of devastation that surpassed anything he had witnessed in 2 years of Pacific combat. Limestone blocks the size of automobiles had fallen from the ceiling, crushing equipment and creating an almost impenetrable barrier between the entrance and the deeper cave systems. The acrid smell of cordite, mixed with limestone dust, created a choking atmosphere that made breathing difficult, even at the entrance. "Hello in there!" Harrison called in English, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Any wounded who need medical attention?" The question was both humanitarian and tactical, intended to determine whether active resistance remained while offering the possibility of surrender. Japanese troops on Leyte had occasionally accepted medical aid for seriously wounded comrades, though such instances were rare. A weak voice responded in heavily accented English from somewhere deep in the rubble. "American soldiers. We have injured men. No more fighting." The speaker was Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, his voice strained with pain and exhaustion. The collapse had crushed his left shoulder, but more importantly, it had made clear that further resistance was impossible. His surviving men were trapped, their weapons buried, their ammunition inaccessible. Mitchell approached the cave mouth, his bar slung across his back, replaced now by his M1 carbine for close quarters work. The transition from automatic rifleman to cave fighter required different weapons and different tactics. Inside the confined space, the long barrel of the bar would be a disadvantage, while the carbine's lightweight and rapid rate of fire made it ideal for tunnel fighting. Thompson had established a casualty collection point where Rodriguez could receive proper medical attention. The Puerto Rican soldier's wound, while painful, had missed major arteries and bones. A proper field dressing and sulfa powder would prevent infection until he could be evacuated to a field hospital. More importantly, Thompson had recovered Rodriguez's rifle and found it still functional despite the bullet strike to its stock. The rescue operation required careful planning and precise execution. Each limestone block had to be moved slowly and deliberately to prevent further collapse while creating access routes to the trapped Japanese soldiers. Harrison organized his men into teams, with Mitchell and Murphy handling the heavier lifting while Thompson maintained security and provided medical supplies as needed. Inside the cave, Sergeant Tanaka waited in darkness, his legs completely numb from the crushing weight of fallen rock. Around him, the sounds of American soldiers working gradually grew closer. His military training demanded that he resist to the final breath, but his practical experience told him that resistance was no longer possible. The machine gun that had been his primary weapon was destroyed, his ammunition was buried, and his legs were probably beyond surgical repair. According to post-war interviews with Japanese survivors, documented in the Pacific War Research Society's archives, the psychological impact of sudden helplessness was often more devastating than physical injuries. Soldiers who had maintained disciplined resistance for days or weeks could find themselves completely demoralized when their defensive positions became death traps. The collapse of the cave complex represented not just physical defeat, but the failure of their tactical doctrine. Mitchell's first view of the cave's interior, illuminated by Harrison's flashlight, revealed the devastating effectiveness of his bar burst. The limestone ceiling showed clear impact marks where .30-06 bullets had struck already weakened rock formations. Each round had removed small amounts of supporting material, but cumulatively they had triggered a collapse that no amount of Japanese engineering could have prevented. "Sarge, there's at least 3 men alive in there," Mitchell reported after crawling partway into the cave mouth. "One of them is an officer. Sounds like he speaks pretty good English. They're asking for medical help." The young soldier's voice carried a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Victory in combat was rarely as clean or satisfying as training had suggested it would be. The extractio of trapped Japanese soldiers required 4 hours of careful work in the failing afternoon light. Harrison had radioed for engineer support, but the 24th Infantry Division's combat engineers were committed to clearing other cave complexes along the Ormoc Bay perimeter. Mitchell's squad would have to manage the rescue operation with their basic infantry equipment and whatever improvised tools they could fabricate from battlefield debris. Mitchell found himself working alongside men who had been trying to kill him hours earlier, a situation that war had made commonplace but never comfortable. Sergeant Tanaka, despite his crushed legs and obvious pain, insisted on helping direct the removal of limestone blocks that trapped his fellow soldiers. His English, learned during peacetime service in Manchuria, was sufficient for basic communication about the rescue operation. "The heavy rock, there," Tanaka pointed with his uninjured arm toward a limestone slab that pinned 2 Japanese soldiers. "If you lift from this side, they can crawl free." His voice was weak but determined, and Mitchell noticed that the Japanese sergeant continued to follow military protocol even in defeat, addressing American soldiers by their visible ranks and maintaining tactical awareness of the situation. Thompson had established a field aid station 20 yards from the cave mouth, where both American and Japanese wounded received treatment according to the same medical protocols. Rodriguez sat propped against a palm tree, his shoulder bandaged, but his spirits recovering as sulfa powder began to combat potential infection. The Puerto Rican soldier watched with professional interest as Thompson treated Japanese casualties with the same care he had provided to American wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto was the most seriously injured of the cave's occupants, his left arm crushed by falling limestone and his breathing labored from probable internal injuries. When Mitchell and Murphy finally extracted him from the debris, the Japanese officer insisted on standing unaided despite obvious pain. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, commanding officer of this position," he announced formally. "I surrender my command to you." The formal surrender was conducted according to military protocol that both sides understood. Harrison accepted Yamamoto's sword and sidearm while ensuring that the Japanese officer received immediate medical attention. Such ceremonies had become routine in Pacific combat, though they never lost their significance for the combatants involved. Victory and defeat were personal experiences that transcended national boundaries and political ideologies. Murphy's examination of the cave's interior revealed the extent of structural damage caused by Mitchell's bar burst. What had appeared to be solid limestone construction was actually a complex formation of interconnected chambers and passages, weakened by decades of water erosion and geological stress. The Japanese had reinforced critical load-bearing sections with timber and steel, but they had failed to account for the cascading failure that precise gunfire could trigger. According to technical reports filed by Army Corps of Engineers surveyors, archived at the National Archives, the Leyte cave complexes represented sophisticated defensive engineering adapted to local geological conditions. Japanese military engineers had transformed natural limestone formations into fortress systems that maximized defensive firepower while providing protection from artillery bombardment. However, these modifications often created structural vulnerabilities that could be exploited by knowledgeable attackers. The final Japanese soldier extracted from the cave was a teenage private who had been buried for nearly 5 hours under limestone debris. His legs were broken, and he showed signs of severe shock, but he remained conscious and alert. Thompson's medical treatment probably saved the young soldier's life, though extensive rehabilitation would be required before he could walk again. As darkness fell over the Leyte battlefield, Mitchell's squad had secured the cave complex and rescued 8 Japanese survivors from what had appeared to be certain death. The tactical victory was significant, eliminating a defensive position that had stalled American advances for 3 days. But the human cost of that victory, measured in broken bodies and shattered lives on both sides, provided a sobering reminder of warfare's true price. 3 days after the cave collapse, a team of military investigators arrived to examine the site and determine exactly what had caused the sudden structural failure. Colonel James Patterson of the Army Corps of Engineers brought with him specialists in geology, structural engineering, and ballistics, tasked with understanding how a single burst of rifle fire had accomplished what sustained artillery bombardment had failed to achieve. Mitchell found himself being interviewed extensively about the circumstances surrounding his decisive shots. "Describe the exact moment when you decided to fire," Colonel Patterson requested, his stenographer recording every detail. "What did you see in your sight picture? How many rounds did you fire? What was the duration of the burst?" The questions were technical and precise, designed to create a complete reconstruction of the tactical situation. The ballistics examination revealed that Mitchell's bar burst had struck the cave ceiling at precisely the angle needed to exploit pre-existing structural weaknesses. Limestone formations on Leyte, formed by millions of years of coral reef deposits and subsequent geological uplift, contained natural fracture patterns that could be triggered by concentrated kinetic energy applied at specific points. The Japanese engineers who had reinforced the cave had unknowingly created additional stress concentrations that amplified the effect of small arms fire. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, recovering from surgery at a field hospital near Tacloban, provided his perspective on the defensive preparations that had made the cave complex seem impregnable. "We removed too much supporting rock to create wider firing positions for our machine guns," he admitted through a translator. "Our engineers warned that this might weaken the ceiling, but we believed American artillery was the only threat to the structural integrity of our position." Sergeant Tanaka's account provided additional details about the moments immediately following the collapse. "The sound was like thunder inside the cave," he explained to intelligence officers conducting prisoner interviews. "First there was the noise of bullets hitting rock, then a cracking sound, then everything falling at once. We had no warning, No time to escape. His testimony was recorded in documents later archived by the Army Military History Institute. The investigation also examined the tactical circumstances that had allowed Mitchell to achieve such precise shot placement. Weather conditions on November 23rd had been ideal for accurate rifle fire, with minimal wind and good visibility despite jungle cover. Mitchell's firing position had provided a stable platform with clear observation of the target area, while his experience with the bar's ballistics characteristics had enabled him to compensate for the weapon's tendency to climb during automatic fire. Colonel Patterson's technical report, classified at the time but later declassified and deposited at the Army War College, concluded that the cave collapse represented a 1,000,000-to-1 convergence of geological, tactical, and ballistic factors. The limestone formation's specific structural characteristics, combined with Japanese engineering modifications and the precise angle of Mitchell's gunfire, had created conditions for catastrophic failure that could not have been predicted or deliberately planned. The psychological impact of the cave collapse extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Other Japanese defensive positions along the Ormoc Bay perimeter began surrendering more readily when word spread that seemingly impregnable fortifications could be destroyed by small arms fire. The myth of invulnerability that had sustained Japanese morale during months of defensive fighting was shattered by the sudden vulnerability revealed at Mitchell's cave complex. Mitchell himself struggled to process the magnitude of what his split-second decision had accomplished. "I was just trying to keep their heads down so my squad could advance," he explained to the investigating officers. "I never intended to bring down the whole cave. I was aiming at the soldier I could see moving between positions, trying to prevent him from reinforcing their machine guns." The young soldier's humility was evident in every aspect of his testimony. The broader implications of the cave collapse influenced American tactical doctrine for subsequent Pacific operations. Infantry training programs began emphasizing the importance of understanding geological conditions when attacking cave complexes, while combat engineers developed new techniques for identifying structural vulnerabilities in limestone formations. The lessons learned from Mitchell's bar burst would save American lives in future cave fighting operations on Okinawa and other Pacific islands. 6 months after the Lady Cave collapse, Private First Class Johnny Mitchell found himself testifying before a congressional committee investigating combat effectiveness in the Pacific Theater. The modest young soldier from rural Kentucky sat uncomfortably in his dress uniform as senators and representatives questioned him about the tactical circumstances that had led to his remarkable achievement. His testimony was recorded in the Congressional Record and later cited in numerous military studies of small unit actions. The Bronze Star Medal that Mitchell received for his actions came with a citation that read, in part, "Private First Class Mitchell's accurate and determined fire resulted in the neutralization of a heavily fortified enemy position that had resisted all previous assault attempts, directly contributing to the success of operations in the Ormoc Bay sector." The ceremony was conducted by General Douglas MacArthur himself, who used the occasion to emphasize the importance of individual initiative in achieving tactical objectives. Lieutenant Colonel Yamamoto, after his recovery from injuries sustained in the cave collapse, spent the remainder of the war in an Allied prisoner of war camp in the Philippines. His post-war memoir, translated and published in 1953, provided a Japanese perspective on the cave fighting that emphasized the psychological impact of sudden technological surprise. "We had prepared for artillery, for aircraft, for tanks," he wrote. "We had not prepared for the possibility that one soldier with one weapon could destroy our position in seconds." The geological survey conducted after the war revealed that similar limestone formations throughout the Pacific Islands contained comparable structural vulnerabilities. Cave complexes on Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and other Japanese-held islands showed evidence of natural fracture patterns that could potentially be exploited by precise small arms fire. This information was incorporated into training programs for future military operations, though the specific geological conditions that made Mitchell's achievement possible were rarely duplicated. Sergeant Tanaka survived his injuries and returned to Japan after the war, where he worked as a translator for the Allied occupation forces. His detailed knowledge of American military tactics, gained through direct combat experience and subsequent prisoner interviews, made him valuable to both sides in the complex process of post-war reconstruction. In his later writings, he described Mitchell's bar burst as representing the decisive moment when technological warfare transitioned from mass destruction to precision targeting. The cave complex itself became a site of military historical interest, visited by staff officers and combat historians studying the evolution of infantry tactics in the Pacific Theater. The precise impact points where Mitchell's .30-06 rounds had struck the limestone ceiling were marked and preserved as evidence of how individual marksmanship could achieve strategic objectives. The site was later designated as a historical monument by the Philippine government. Mitchell returned to Kentucky after the war and lived quietly as a farmer and occasional hunting guide, rarely discussing his military service except with other veterans who understood the psychological complexities of combat survival. He declined numerous requests for interviews and book projects, preferring to let the official records speak for themselves. His humility and reluctance to capitalize on his wartime fame became legendary among Pacific Theater veterans. The tactical lessons derived from the cave collapse influenced American military doctrine throughout the Cold War period and beyond. Infantry training emphasized the importance of understanding terrain and geological conditions when planning assault operations, while weapons development programs explored ways to enhance the precision and effectiveness of squad-level automatic weapons. Mitchell's achievement demonstrated that individual soldiers armed with standard infantry weapons could accomplish objectives that had previously required heavy artillery or specialized demolitions. Today, the story of Mitchell's bar burst is taught in military academies worldwide as an example of how tactical innovation and precise execution can overcome seemingly impossible odds. The young soldier's split-second decision to fire at a moving target resulted in consequences that neither he nor his enemies could have anticipated, proving that warfare's ultimate unpredictability often lies not in grand strategy, but in the actions of individual combatants facing life-and-death decisions in the crucible of battle.